Color Out of Space is one of the most effective horror movies I've seen in over a decade, serving as the first entry in Richard Stanley's H.P. Lovecraft adaptation trilogy. Color Out of Space has already been met by rave reviews from not only horror fans, but also H.P. Lovecraft fans. For those unaware of who Richard Stanley is, I highly recommend watching the documentary Lost Souls, The Doomed Journey of Richard Stanley's Island of Dr. Moreau. Following a few indie successes, Stanley was set to direct the 90s adaptation of The Island of Dr. Moreau, filming in Queensland, Australia. All throughout pre-production and the beginning of production, there was conflicts between the studio and Richard Stanley over the vision of the film. And once filming began, there were problems between the director and Val Kilmer. Ultimately, Stanley was fired and replaced by John Frankenheimer. The studio gave Stanley his ticket to fly back home, but he never made it to the airport. In a nutshell, Stanley went on a drug and alcohol bender in the Australian outback, met some of the crew members that were still working on the film, and snuck back onto the film set where he wore full body costumes and was an extra in the background of some of the shots, to which no one had any idea he was there. Absolutely crazy. My housemates at the time actually worked on the documentary, interviewing the Australian crew members, and they would tell me these stories before the documentary was even completed. So that's how I know about Richard Stanley. And this will be his first feature film ever since getting kicked off of that movie. And now seeing Color Out of Space and seeing Stanley's proper craft as a filmmaker, yeah, prob shouldn't have fired him, eh? Speaking of this movie, Stanley has been a H.P. Lovecraft fan ever since his mother would read him H.P. Lovecraft stories as a child. He developed the script for this movie 10 years ago and has been shopping it around the world ever since. And that's roughly the journey of this film up until now. Gonna try to keep this spoiler free because everyone who loves horror movies need to see this movie. I'll probably release a more in-depth discussion video at a later date. And that being said, let's get into it. The story starts off shortly after the Gardner family moves into a farm in the countryside of Arkham. Nicolas Cage plays the father, Nathan, who wants to grow tomatoes and milk alpacas. Hang in there. His wife Teresa, played by Jolie Richardson, is an online financial advisor who recently had a mastectomy due to breast cancer. Their daughter, Lavinia, is a practicing witch. Once again, hang in there. Their eldest son is a pothead who hangs out with Tommy Chong. Stay with me. And their youngest son who is very quiet and hangs out with the dog while drawing. Now, none of that makes for a cheery, happy family. There's a lot of tension between all of the family members. Nathan and Teresa's intimate relationship is rocky due to her surgery. No one understands the daughter, and the son kind of keeps to himself. And the youngest son is very disconnected. One night, a meteorite crash lands on the farm. Glowing pink flashes flood the entire farm. All of the family members seem to be affected by the crashing, with the youngest son being exposed directly by the glowing pink color. They all run outside to discover a glowing pink meteorite in the center of a newly formed crater on their farm. And then as the movie progresses, they all begin to be affected by this mysterious space rock each. Conflict begins rising between all of the family members, which leads to more problems. At this time, the environment begins changing. The foliage begins changing to the same color as the meteorite. Mutated species of pink lizards and insects begin appearing. And that's all I'm touching on the plot. There's your setup, and I don't want to give away any more details. For the most part, this is a character movie. A slow burn of characters slowly losing their minds, which then makes you feel like you're losing your mind, as well as horrific cosmic influences begin transforming them and the life of the alpaca farm. However, spoilers makes the tomatoes taste awful. As someone who's never read a Lovecraft novel before, I haven't been without friends who are massive Lovecraft nuts and never let me not understand what Lovecraft is all about. I've always known that the stories are, for the most part, how characters go insane, and Cthulhu isn't just a big kaiju that knocks over buildings and then gets nuked at the end of the story. This is the first movie where it felt like everything I've been told about H.P. Lovecraft is finally true. The scariest aspects of this movie aren't being chased by monsters or creatures. Well, not in a modern contemporary way. This movie has its creatures, and oh boy, and it ain't no nun or La Llorona popping out of the shadows, I'll tell you that. But the scariest aspects of this movie is the human mind. This movie spends a great deal with the family, dealing with their inner conflicts, the isolation of living in the middle of nowhere, and even once the meteorite lands on the farm, everyone aside from the daughter spend most of the first half ignoring or denying any strange happenings, which wonderfully builds towards this point of no return. By the time the family accept that maybe something messed up's going on, they're already in the thick of it, and it has a great bounce bouncing around of disbelief. Everyone is dealing with a different mindfuck each, and no one is dealing with the same thing, so no one is believing one another. Nicolas Cage's character becomes the biggest conflict within the family, very much like Jack Torrance in The Shining. The biggest denier of the events unfolding becomes the most aggressive when anyone tries to rationalize with him. Then he turns out to be the one that loses their mind the most. The brother is mostly a pothead and tries to block out what's happening. The sister is more alert to what's going on, probably because she assumes responsibility due to her ritual at the start of the film she was performing, whether the film's events are a cause of that or not. The mother becomes overwhelmed and unresponsive and injures herself at one point, taking her and Nick Cage out of the picture for a short while. But one of the creepiest tropes of this movie is the youngest son who is directly exposed to the bright lights when the meteorite lands. There's a lot of unsettling scenes of the kid just staring at nothing and all the characters don't know why, communicating with whatever this unseen entity is taking over the house. Overall, a great creepy build up to the third act, and very much like the shocking scene from Hereditary, once what happens to Charlie in that film, everything goes off the rails. It descends into madness and all the characters fall apart. This film has its own shocking moment. After all of the characters denying what's happening, something truly disturbing happens. And I do not want to say what it is because I encourage going into this movie as blind as possible. Once this moment happens, my jaw hit the floor and it stayed there until the movie was over. After being suffocated by the onslaught of jump scare horror movies with paper thin gimmicks, no story, and just loud noises for an hour and a half, this movie delivers what I've been begging for, craving for, demanding for so long. Every once in a while you get good little indie horror movies that have bits of it. Hereditary, The Witch, Starry Eyes, It Follows, to name a few. The one thing this movie delivers on is fucked up ideas. Not things cued by a loud noise, not just the imagery of dark eyelids and glowing yellow eyes, not adding in gore for shock value's sake, not having a pathetic script with bland characters that are so boring that any type of horror moment seems amazing due to being swamped by boredom. All of the above is fine for horror movies. Subgenres are subgenres, but I feel we've been oversaturated by all of that for the past 10 years. There has been a sad lack of fucked up ideas in horror movies of late. When something so messed up happens on screen, not just that it came as a shock, but when it stays in your brain longer, knowing how much more fucked your characters are, as well as trying to process how they got to this point and what they have to deal with going forward, fucked up ideas push you in the heads of the characters. But you can't just start off having something mind-bendingly horrific happen. You need the discipline to build up to it. If your fellow camper vanishes after the first night and you get a bag full of their body parts in a twig parcel the next morning, well, that's just gore. But when you spend a whole movie just assuming that you and your friends are lost and don't know if you're being pranked or just imagining things, having a moment like that happen after all of that build-up and you still don't know what the threat is, that's fucked up. It's not fucked up that Freddy attacks you in your dreams with a knife glove. It's fucked up that he slaughtered all of your friends and is hunting you, and you can't tell anyone. Being in such a horrific life or death scenario, and you can't get help from anyone because it sounds fucking ridiculous. Call the cops, someone is trying to kill me in my dreams. Sure, it's scary being stalked by a sexually transmitted demon that walks very slowly towards you no matter where you go, but it's fucked up having to throw away all of your morality to have sex with a couple of strangers on a boat, transmitting the demon to them just so you can get a night's rest before back to running. This movie very slowly builds on a looming threat caused by the meteorite that landed, and once its first fucked up idea moment happens, there is absolutely no turning back. This is something I would love to discuss in a later spoiler video, and its other connections to H.P. Lovecraft novels. I've seen criticism of this movie, mostly trashing Nicolas Cage's performance. I understand Nicolas Cage comes with his own celebrity history and quirks, but for me, nothing about his performance sucked me out of the movie. He does a lot of weird things in this film, but he's like Jack Nicholson at this point. He used to play different types of characters once upon a time ago, but now they are just, what they give is what you get. But he's not a bad actor. Whenever I see Nick Cage in a movie now, it's like that scene from The Grudge where Buffy is in the flashback of Bill Pullman prior to the events of the movie. It feels like you have entered in the Nick Cage bubble, and if he looks in your direction, you won't know if he's looking at you specifically. You feel like you're in his world. It's sort of fascinating watching him commit to being weird. There's a running thing in this movie that once the meteorite lands, his character is constantly smelling a rotting stench and is pissing him off, but it's not funny because he's overacting about it. It's funny how much you believe how pissed off he is about it. I think one of the biggest comparisons to this movie, which is putting people off of seeing it, is its similarities to Mandy. Both had the same producers and featured Nick Cage, but these movies couldn't be any different. Mandy is more of a revenge exploitation artsy film, where this movie feels more like a classy 70s style horror. I would put this film up there with the 70s invasion of the Body Snatchers, The Thing, The Exorcist. It's like The Evil Dead, but made with the classy direction of The Shining. Now the criticism I'm seeing is this movie is boring. Ironic because in this case I must disagree. Boring has a different definition these days for me personally. Characters that feel like plot placeholders, spouting out improvisational humor, jump scares and red herring jump scares, and characters vocally regurgitating what is happening and what's going to happen, being baby stepped throughout the horror concept. Color Out of Space spends its first 2 acts showing you a family living in isolation and how tense their relationships are. The brewing horror of the meteorite is out of their control or understanding. It's as if the world is changing around this family and their problems, before they finally get sucked up into it. It's always refreshing to not know where a horror movie is going. Not that this movie is nonsensical, but once it starts taking you on a journey, your knowledge of cliches and archetypes won't save you. And if this is the beginning of a H.P. Lovecraft cinematic universe with Richard Stanley at the helm, then I love this recipe, and I'm on board for more. This movie has been one of the most effective experiences I've had in a cinema for so long. I honestly have no faults with this movie. Nick Cage does like weird voices sometimes to mock his daughter. Some of the CGI is a bit cheap due to the low budget. There's some off-character developing dialogue at the start, but this movie wasn't made to waste your time. Regardless if you like the subject matter or not, it was made with love and dedication and attention to detail. $15.50 out of $15.50. I can't recommend this movie enough. This film was an experience, not a product.